This is Football at 4.
Football at 4 is powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. It's brought to you by Bet365. Whatever the moment, whatever the sport, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Mike Gill with you. Andrew DiCecco will be here in a minute. The two coordinators spoke earlier. We'll get Andrew's reaction to that. Also, more on some of the stuff that Andrew's opining about over at InsideTheBirds.com. One of the articles he wrote, I talked about with Moshe on Monday. I love this article about Britton Covey and his role moving forward. It feels like the Eagles have loaded up on the return game. What does that mean for Britton moving forward here? We'll get his thoughts on that and some other things now. But first, I want to get his thoughts on his first impressions of Kellen Moore. Now, obviously, everybody thought Kellen, when he got hired, this was way back in February that he got hired. We finally hear from him here in May, Andrew. I think a lot of people were waiting to hear from both of these guys, but let's start with Kellen Moore, the offensive coordinator, because he has a new system, and everybody's wondering how this system is going to come and blend in here. We've heard a lot about blending this thing together. So what did you think about what he had to say today about how his system is different from what the Eagles have done during the Sirianni era?
Well, big picture takeaways, you're getting two big league coordinators that have run rooms before, and that was very evident watching both of those guys at the podium. And, just sitting there listening to Kellen Moore, who you just asked me about, you get the sense that, well, he mentioned just making sure the language is consistent as far as some of the bigger challenges when it comes to blending offensive systems. But you're going to see a lot more motion, and he answered that in a pretty elaborate way. So you're going to see different wrinkles, and I just think that they both coordinators really talk about simplicity and molding their systems around around their players and personnel to put them in position to be successful. He also mentioned having Saquon Barkley and how he's going to utilize him. And, he didn't talk about throwing the ball to running backs, but I think that's going to be another wrinkle that you're going to see in his offense. But I was really impressed with both guys.
Yeah, we'll get to Fangio and some things there. The blending of philosophy, that is the thing. The whole terminology is really what he said is going to be the big thing there is just how to, name the different things, whether you name it what they did in Dallas or in L.A. or what they've had here over the years. So we'll see that. What did you think about his first impressions of Jalen Hurts and how he's a uniquely different quarterback than the guys he's had in the past?
Yeah, I think that anyone listening to that should be encouraged in knowing that he is it's foreign terrain for Kellen Moore to work with a quarterback that's so immensely talented and has all these different dimensions that he can provide to an offense. And knowing that, and he can kind of open up the entire playbook, and you just get this sense that he's really enamored and excited to work with a player of Jalen Hurts' caliber. And it's also interesting to note that he will be working with Doug Nussmeier, who he has a long-standing relationship with, the quarterback's coach who they brought over. So I think between the two of those guys, you're going to see them be able to tap in to something that Jalen Hurts, a level that he wasn't able to get to reach last season for various reasons. And the sky's really the limit. And I can't wait to see how they choose to deploy him and accentuate what he really does well.
Yeah, I mean, he was asked, too, about having Hurts, who was such a good threat in the run game as opposed to some of the other guys. And, I wonder from you, do we think that they will kind of let Jalen be a bigger part of the run game this year than he was a year ago?
I do, and that +1, and we talked about it 2 years ago where it was so evidently crippling for defenses trying to account for that, and the running game was a byproduct. Though the running game was amplified, and it was a byproduct of Jalen Hurts and teams having to be cognizant of him pulling the ball. So I think you're going to see them revert back to that. Look, that's what makes Jalen Hurts such a unique talent. His ability to be he calls it himself a triple threat. The third aspect being his mind and how he's able to kind of defeat defenders in that regard. But I think that doing all that, you don't want to take away what makes him special, what makes him great, and what puts stresses on defenses like that. So I really do think they're going to revert back to that and tap into it.
All right, Andrew DiCecco, Football at 4, looking at the coordinators both today. They spoke, and John McMullen, our buddy, asked about motion. We heard so much about motion the last couple of years. That's been one of the big bugaboos from people that the previous regime, not enough motion, not creative enough. What do you think about Kellen Moore's answer to what he believes in motion in his offense?
Yeah, anyone who's followed Kellen Moore or watched any of his offenses, when he came over, you just know that there's going to be the Eagles are going to be among the league leaders in motion, and that helps with spacing, and it opens up a multitude of different things you're able to do offensively and how you're able to attack a defense. So that really wasn't a surprise to me, but I think just kind of hearing it and knowing that, hey, look, this is what we're going to do, you finally hear it from the man himself. I think it's just going to completely add a new dimension and how teams are going to have to play the Eagles and account for it. And they have a lot of players that are very well equipped in being, effective motion players and creating spacing. So that just completely adds another dimension to an already prolific offense.
I definitely want to get your impression on his impression of Barkley. Like, does it sound like, because there's been a lot of maybe misnomers about how he uses his running backs. He's had Austin Eckler, he had Zeke Elliott, Pollard, that duo down there. And a lot of people, I think, give him this notion that he doesn't run the ball a lot or enough. So when you heard him talk about Barkley, what was your takeaway?
Just knowing that he's well aware that he has an elite player at that position, and he's going to make sure that he uses them. And I think there is a misconception, and you and I have talked about this when they hired him at various points, that he's averse to running the football and he's pass happy. Well, just take a look at where the Cowboys ranked when he was there under his tutelage there, as far as where Ezekiel Elliott ranked among the league leaders in carries. And they're right up there, and they threw the ball to his running backs as well. So I think that you're going to see them really lean on that aspect of the offense and Saquon Barkley, and not just ignore it like they did with DeAndre Swift last year. He's well aware of the talent that he has, and you're going to see that come to fruition as long as he's able to stay healthy.
I like, he was asked about Sirianni, and it sounds like I don't know if you notice this as well, Andrew, is when anybody gets asked about Sirianni, it seems like it's a very similar answer about how detail-oriented he is and how he holds guys accountable. That seems to be almost the answer across. It's like when Jalen Hurts came into the league, everyone would ask, what do you know about him? Well, he's a great leader, was always the default answer. It sounds like Kellen Moore also has this same opinion of Nick Sirianni and his short dealings with him.
Yeah, and for those who wonder what Nick Sirianni does, these are perfect examples of what makes him certain areas of his coaching prowess that really allows him to stand apart, and there's something that he can hang his hat on. Now, that's not it's not just exclusive to Kellen Moore or different coaches that have come in and said those same things, that have echoed those sentiments. There's been players I've spoken to that are quick to point out those qualities that Nick Sirianni has that makes him such a good coach. And I think that's important to note. Being detail-oriented, being somebody who's going to hold people accountable. And I think that last season you didn't really see, well, we don't really know, but there was a lot of errors in communication and things like that. And I have every evidence, I have every reason to believe that he was holding players accountable behind closed doors.
All right. He was asked about, he being Kellen Moore, we're talking with Andrew DiCecco, Football 4. Kellen Moore was asked about what he saw from the offense the last 6-7 games. Sirianni, has kind of said things got stale a little bit. What did he see? He says, I wasn't around for it. I'm a bad judge. But yesterday, Kenny Gainwell came out and said there was a lack of connection as to why things went awry. What do you think he was referencing in that podcast when asked about it? Because obviously Kellen Moore is saying, I can't answer that question. I wasn't even here. But it sounded like Gainwell put some thoughts on it that was a lack of connection from front office players not talking to each other. Was that a surprise to hear?
No, not really. I mean, you've heard different players intimate that over the last several months. And you know me, Mike, I'm never one to speculate, but I would just assume that he was talking about front office disconnect with the players in the locker room, or maybe there was a offense and defense type thing. I don't know. That was last season. This season they have a very there's a roster in transition. But they've added a lot of new people, new players, and fresh faces on the coaching staff. So I have to think that they're trending in the right direction, and that's going to be in the rear view. He was just asked a question, and he answered it.
Yeah, and I weave that in a little bit only because some people have questioned the culture in this. And after listening to LaShawn McCoy and Deshaun Jackson talk about that whole Chip Kelly thing and how Mr. Lurie and Howie Roseman were able to pull them out of that, it sounded like such a dysfunctional mess with Chip Kelly here. And 2 years later, you win a Super Bowl. It kind of for people to question the culture is a little head scratching. Hearing today the LaShawn McCoy and Deshaun Jackson, what happened during that Kelly era, just sounded like total dysfunction. And then to win a Super Bowl shortly thereafter, kind of questioning the culture to me is a bit of a head scratcher.
Yeah, I mean, that was a drastic circumstance under Chip Kelly, totally dysfunctional, not the same thing as what we're talking about with Nick Sirianni at all, or he wouldn't be back here. But I think that there was a division, where that was, who knows? And frankly, it's not really important as long as everybody's on the same page now and they're moving forward. But I just think that when you're comparing the two, there really isn't any. I think that someone who, like Nick Sirianni, who prides himself on culture and connecting, those are part of his core values, and that's something that they're going to lean on moving forward. Him, especially now that he's sort of overtaken that CEO type of head coach. So I don't think that that's going to be an issue again. I think they've ironed out what they had to, and they're moving forward.
They are moving forward. They're moving forward with Vic Fangio on defense. He spoke today. A lot of wide-ranging thoughts about his career, players today. He didn't mention very many players by name. One that he did was Zach Bond, and I thought that was a very interesting storyline there because did they have a guy in Zach Bond that they're thinking about using in a way that maybe none of us envisioned and have a bigger role for him than maybe we thought?
Well, it raised my antennas, but also made me go back and think, do they have significant plans, or is that just the first name that came to mind? And the question is, when they targeted him very early in free agency, may have even been the first day, so many different things have happened over the course of a couple of months, it's hard to keep track. But there's obviously a lot of interest in Zach Bond. He's going to get a long look. Now, do I envision him as an inside linebacker? I did not when they brought him in. I saw him purely as an edge rusher. And if you remember, when they brought him there and he's sitting on the podium in his introductory press conference, he didn't even know what their plan was for him. At least he didn't reveal it. So I thought that was kind of interesting. Now, it is important to note that at Wisconsin, he was an outside linebacker, and he was pretty fluid and adept at moving in space. But I think pigeonholing him as an inside linebacker was really interesting. He's going to probably get a long look there. And it's also interesting is that Michael Clay, when I asked him about a couple of players that he expects to take a big leap or to hold an impactful role in his unit, the first player he also mentioned was Zach Bond. So he's gonna have a role football team. Just at what capacity remains to be seen. I mean, to be fair, Vic Fangio didn't really know any of the other linebackers. He had to pull out the roster. It was sort of running down the list as we were sort of throwing names at him.
Yeah, he mentioned White by name. He mentioned Dean, very short in passing, and he said, "Oh, who am I forgetting here?" And Oren Burks.
We got Burks, Trotter, Van Sumeren. He'll get familiar, but I think that it's important to note that there's only a few names that he even knew.
It's clear, Andrew, that versatility in both his scheme, the way he calls a defense, and his players is pretty important to him. And that's why it'll be interesting. I guess he didn't really give a clear answer to. I don't know that he was even asked of what his intentions were for a guy like Cooper DeJean, but it sounds like versatility was a word that he used multiple times today.
Yeah, exactly. And, like you and I have talked about over the past couple months, it's not really a surprise. He prides himself, his principles defensively sort of pertain around versatility, highly intelligent football players are able to execute what he's asking. But he also said today about simplifying things if he realizes that you're in the middle of a game. He said, I'm not going to out-scheme. I'm not going to throw a scheme out there. We're not going to out-scheme somebody. I'm going to simplify things, and we're going to sort of, for lack of a better term, we're going to dumb it down. And I thought that was refreshing because last year you had a lot of players that seemed to be swimming no one was really on the same page. So him and his coaching staff, I feel, is they're going to have that emotional intelligence, be able to adjust, so the players are able to play a lot more fast and freely than restrictive and sort of thinking on the fly.
So later in the conversation, in the press conference, he was asked about Andrew Van Ginkel and his role. Do we think there's a guy on this team that he would view in a similar role?
Just based off today, Zach Bond.
I was wondering if you were going to say that, man.
But I would probably say Bryce Huff if we're being realistic. At least in my view, I think Bryce Huff could be that guy. But based on how effusive he was, or I guess how he was at the front of mind, Zach Bond, I think that's important to note. But I would probably say Bryce Huff would have the best chance to fulfill that Van Ginkel type role.
And two other guys he was asked about. One was Jalen Carter. The other was Jordan Davis. And the one thing he said about Carter that kind of stood out to me, Andrew, was that he wants him to get into great shape, or that he's got to get into great shape so we can play him a lot. It sounds like they have, or he has, I don't want to say higher expectations for Carter, because I think they had high expectations for him last year, but that he envisions playing him a lot of snaps and kind of building the defense around him potentially.
Oh, yeah, and I would also say not only Jalen Carter, but Jordan Davis, who you mentioned. Those two are the foundational building blocks that the defense should be built around. They're two former first-round tackles. They're young. They're at the core, at the front of that defensive line. That you build around those guys. I expect Jalen Carter to play a ton of snaps. I also expect him to take his game to the next level, more reminiscent of the Jalen Carter that we saw earlier in the season last year before he sort of faded out, just like everyone on the defense did. But the big question mark is, to me, Jordan Davis, and can you maximize his ability? Can you get him to play the way that he played the first 8 games, the entirety of the season? Can he sustain that level of play? Vic's going to be really hard on him. That's one of the players, both of those guys. There are two that I think that because he has such high expectations and wants to push them to be operating at their max level, I think he's going to be pretty tough on both players, particularly Davis.
Yeah, and the one thing he did ask, you mentioned Bryce Huff as a guy that potentially could be his version of Van Ginkel. He mentioned that Roseman said, watch him, watch the tape of him, and he said, we liked what we saw on him. So you wonder if Vic Fangio's, voice was a big reason why they ended up targeting and landing Bryce Huff as quickly as they did in free agency, and that maybe they were okay moving on. As we know, this whole story evolved here with Hassan Reddick.
Oh, absolutely. And this is something that I've been asked a few different times over the offseason. Do you think that Vic Fangio is going to have full autonomy in bringing players in, or what the case would be? And I said, probably not the player, the exact player, but he may be able to say, these are some of the traits that I'm looking for. These are some of the positions that we have to place a higher emphasis on and make sure that we're upgrading in those areas significantly. And to your point about moving off of Hassan Reddick, who knows how he viewed him, but I can tell you this, the edge rushers on this team are going to be asked to drop back in coverage a lot more than they have. And that's something that was not Hassan Reddick's strong suit, where it is a strong suit of guys like Huff. I think you're going to see Zach Bond be a little bit more adept at doing it. And I think in time, Jalix Hunt will be able to do that just based on his pure athleticism. We still have yet to see how he's going to develop his play strength and be able to combat offensive linemen. But I think playing in space really plays to his strengths.
It's important to note, as you just did, that he was asked about dropping his edge rushers into coverage. Fangio admitted, yes, they will drop. So for those of you who were not happy about seeing that last year, with Patricia did it a lot more. Get ready to see some more of that. Fangio has said that, yes, they will do that. Andrew, I want to go over to your article that you wrote over at InsideTheBirds.com. It's a great one because I talked about this not because I asked about it on Monday, but because you and I are on the same wavelength here. I'm interested to see what happens with Britton Covey and that all the returners, with the kickoffs now being bigger and now the punt returners, they brought a lot of competition in here. So as you wrote, Covey versus the field, how do you see that thing kind of mapping out?
Well, it's a fascinating development, Mike, because last summer, Covey and Boston Scott were largely uncontested in their return roles. Covey even had a hamstring injury and missed most of the summer. and he still made the roster and everything like that. And that was before the breakthrough in which he led the league in punt return yards, and he was second in the NFL in punt return average at 14.4 yards. Now it's a crowded group because you have Isaiah Rodgers, who's a kick returner. You have Cooper DeJean, who is a punt returner, a very prolific one at Iowa. You have Will Shipley, who can return kicks. And Anais Smith, whenever he gets healthy, he's still dealing with the stress fracture, so he was sidelined for a rookie minicamp. But all of a sudden, you have a bunch of different guys that provide positional value in addition to their special teams upside. So that may be where you see someone like Covey run into an issue because he really – and to be fair, Britton really hasn't been given an opportunity to thrive as a wide receiver. He did have that injury last summer. But I think it's important to note that guys like Anais Smith are going to factor into their plans offensively. Will Shipley offensively. Isaiah Rodgers, if he makes the roster, is going to be a corner and can be a kick returner. So all these guys give you game day value and versatility, which I think could come into play this summer.
By the way, I know you tweeted about Michael Clay, who brought up his special teams guys. He mentioned Josh Jobe, Ben Van Sumeren, Sidney Brown. I saw some video of Sidney Brown on the field hoisting up some weight today. He had ACL. Is he, you think, going to be ready for camp?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. You know, Jobe, I think, is far from a long shot. I know a lot of folks are writing him off, but we really don't know how coaches see him or how he's going to develop under a new coaching staff. Van Sumeren, I think, is going to factor prominently in the linebacker picture. And then Sidney Brown, I think he may be ready for week one or very early into the season. He was adamant about that when I spoke to him at locker room clean out, that he goes, this is nothing. I'm going to, whatever the timeline was, he goes, I'm going to beat it. I'm going to be back. And you saw him moving some weight today. Obviously, he didn't move side to side, which is really where the knee is tested. It was more an up and down. But to be able to put that kind of pressure on your legs and everything like that is very encouraging. I think he might make a significant push to be ready by week one.
That would be a big statement there to get him back as well. He was an exciting player in the secondary last year, kind of a Tasmanian devil all over the field. So it will be fun to see what kind of role they have planned for Sidney Brown if they can get him back on the field. Andrew DiCecco, InsideTheBirds.com, and, of course, football at 4 every Thursday right here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. Good stuff, Andrew. We'll catch up with you next time.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.